This is the story of Alfred Harmsworth, the man who became the most powerful newspaper tycoon in history, and the media empire he built with his brother Harold. Known as Lord Northcliffe, he was a revolutionary genius who gave the public a voice, but whose unbridled ambition eventually turned to madness. His life is an epic tale of spectacular success and personal tragedy, charting his journey from a humble childhood in Dublin to the pinnacle of global influence. It chronicles how he founded the Daily Mail, defied governments, and shaped the course of the First World War. But behind the success lay a dark inheritance, a tale of paranoia, political manipulation, and a dynasty forever haunted by the intoxicating poison of unaccountable power. His story begins not in power, but in precarity. Born in Dublin in 1865, Alfred was the eldest of 15 children in a respectable middle-class family that was constantly struggling financially. This struggle became the crucible that forged his character. He watched his intelligent father fail to achieve financial stability and learned a harsh lesson. Cleverness wasn't enough. What mattered was action, enterprise, and an intuitive grasp of what the public wanted. His family's move to London in search of opportunity only intensified this pressure. While his quieter brother Harold chose the stable path of a civil servant, Alfred dove into the chaotic world of freelance journalism. He wasn't just writing, he was studying his audience, learning the anatomy of a compelling story. From editing his school magazine Youth to writing for Bicycling News, he honed his unique talent, understanding that to sell a publication you had to sell a lifestyle, a sense of belonging. This foundational insight, born from a desperate need for security, would soon fuel a media revolution. The London of 1888 was a city of stark contrasts, a place of imperial grandeur and Dickensian squalor, of astonishing wealth and abject poverty. And in a small, unassuming office on Paternoster Square, amidst the clamor of horse-drawn carts and the cries of street vendors, the Harmsworth brothers prepared to launch their revolution. Their venture, Answers to Correspondence, was built on a premise so simple it was radical in a media landscape dominated by dense political reportage. It would answer any and all questions sent in by the public, no matter how trivial or bizarre. The very concept was an act of genius, creating an interactive relationship with the reader, making them a participant in the creation of the magazine's content long before the word interactive was ever coined. The first issue, published on June 2, 1888, was a modest affair, a single folded sheet costing 1 penny. But its contents were unlike anything else on the newsstands. It promised answers to questions that buzzed in the minds of ordinary people but were never addressed by the lofty broadsheets. Why do we blush? Can a clergyman marry himself? How long do horses live? And what is the origin of the Union Jack? It was a miscellany of curiosities, a compendium of fascinating tidbits designed to be read on a tram or during a factory lunch break. Alfred's editorial instinct was flawless. He understood that people were not just interested in parliamentary debates and foreign affairs. They were deeply curious about the world around them, about social etiquette, about the oddities of science and history. Answers, later shortened from its full title, catered directly to this universal human curiosity. Initial sales were respectable but not spectacular, hovering around 12,000 copies a week. It was enough to keep the lights on, but it was far from the sensation Alfred had envisioned. The brothers worked tirelessly, often sleeping on sacks of paper in the office, writing much of the content themselves under a dizzying array of pseudonyms. Alfred was the heart and soul of the publication, his boundless energy and creativity filling every page. He would pore over readers' letters, selecting the most intriguing questions, and then either research the answers himself or invent plausible ones if the truth was too dull. Harold, meanwhile, was the bedrock. He managed the accounts with painstaking precision, negotiated with printers to get the best price for paper, and oversaw the complex logistics of distribution. Every penny was accounted for, every expenditure scrutinized. It was this financial discipline learned in the rigid world of the Inland Revenue that kept the fledgling enterprise afloat in its critical early months. The turning point, the moment that transformed Answers from a modest success into a national phenomenon, came with a stroke of marketing brilliance that would redefine popular journalism. Alfred, ever the showman, understood that to capture the public's imagination, he needed a grand gesture, something that would cut through the noise of Victorian life. He needed to sell not just information, but a dream. He announced a contest, a prize so audacious and aspirational, it seemed almost unbelievable. Answers would offer us a prize of £1 per week for life, a sum that represented a comfortable, worry-free existence for the average working man, to the reader who could most accurately guess the amount of gold bullion held in the vaults of the Bank of England on a specific day. The response was overwhelming. It was more than a contest. It was a national lottery, a chance to escape the drudgery of the factory floor or the anxieties of a clerk's wage forever. The magazine's office was inundated with hundreds of thousands of entries. On postcards, a deluge of hope from every corner of the British Isles. The circulation of Answers skyrocketed. People who had never bought a magazine in their lives were now eagerly purchasing copies, not just for the curious facts, but for the chance to win a life of security. The stunt created a level of public engagement that was simply unprecedented. It was a viral sensation in a pre-digital age. The contest itself was a masterpiece of suspense. Alfred built the drama week after week, publishing lists of near misses and stoking the anticipation. When the winner was finally announced, a young soldier from the Royal Engineers who had come remarkably close to the actual figure, Answers, turned his story into a running feature. They reported on his new life, his marriage, his modest investments. He became a minor celebrity, a living, breathing testament to the fact that dreams could come true, all thanks to Answers. Alfred had not just sold magazines, he had sold hope. By creating a shared national lottery, he had cracked the code of mass market appeal. By the early 1890s, Answers was selling over 1 million copies a week. The Harmsworth brothers were no longer struggling entrepreneurs. They were fabulously, unimaginably wealthy men. With the profits from Answers pouring in, they didn't rest on their laurels. For Alfred, success was not a destination but fuel for the next venture. He and Harold immediately began to diversify, to build what would become their publishing house, Amalgamated Press. Alfred's mind was a relentless idea factory, identifying new audiences and creating products tailored specifically for them. In 1890, they launched Comic Cuts. It was another penny publication, but this time it was aimed squarely at a younger audience. It featured humorous illustrations and simple, amusing stories, a stark contrast to the dense, moralistic literature typically offered to children. Its slogan, proudly displayed on every issue, was "Amusing without being vulgar." This was a direct and brilliant shot at the penny dreadfuls, a calculated promise to parents that this was wholesome, family-friendly entertainment. It was an instant success, tapping into the vast, underserved market for children's reading material and making the Harmsworths a household name among the nation's youth. Shortly after, in 1891, they launched Forget Me Not, one of the first magazines aimed specifically at young women. While other publications might have a ladies column, Forget-Me-Not was entirely dedicated to female interests, romance fiction, the latest fashions from Paris, beauty advice, recipes, and household tips. Alfred had recognized that women, particularly those in the lower middle and working classes, were a powerful and growing consumer group, and he catered to their aspirations and daily concerns with uncanny precision. This was followed by a slew of other successful titles, each a carefully aimed arrow at a specific demographic. Home Chat for the aspirational housewife, The Sunday Companion for the religiously inclined family, and Woman's World for a slightly more sophisticated female reader. Each publication was a carefully crafted product, designed for a specific niche with its own unique voice and identity. By the mid-1890s, Amalgamated Press was the largest periodical publisher in the world, a veritable machine for generating popular content and enormous profits. This was not just the result of Alfred's creative genius, but of Harold's cold, hard business acumen. The brothers established a model of vertical integration that was revolutionary for its time. To control the supply and cost of their most crucial raw material, they invested heavily in paper mills in Newfoundland, Canada, eventually creating a vast logging and production enterprise that guaranteed them a steady, affordable supply of newsprint. They built their own state-of-the-art printing plants in London, equipped with the latest high-speed rotary presses that could churn out millions of copies a week. They established a formidable distribution network that could place their magazines on every newsstand and in every tobacconist shop in the country, in the IA, often within hours of printing. Alfred was the creative visionary, the editor-in-chief of the entire enterprise, his instincts dictating the content and tone of dozens of publications. Harold was the financial wizard, the operational genius who turned Alfred's ideas into profitable, ruthlessly efficient businesses. He was known for his almost fanatical attention to detail and his legendary frugality. Anecdotes from the time tell of him walking through the printing works and being able to spot an inefficiently used roll of paper from 100 yards away, or of him personally scrutinizing expense reports for even the smallest extravagance. While Alfred was dreaming of new worlds to conquer, Harold was ensuring the foundations of their current empire were solid rock. As their wealth grew to staggering proportions, so did their lifestyles. Alfred, now in his late 20s, married Mary Elizabeth Milner, the daughter of a planter from the West Indies. She would become his lifelong companion, the future Lady Northcliffe, a steady and calming presence in his often turbulent life. He bought grand houses, including Sutton Place in Surrey, and embraced the life of a country gentleman. He developed a passion for the new marvel of the age, the motor car, owning a fleet of them and delighting in racing them through the countryside at terrifying speeds. Yet he remained consumed by his work, a restless driving force who could never be satisfied. He was famously demanding, a whirlwind of energy who expected his editors to be on call at all hours, constantly bombarding them with telegrams filled with new ideas, critiques, and commands. Despite having built a publishing empire that dwarfed all others, a company so profitable it was said to be coining money, Alfred felt a gnawing sense of incompleteness. He had conquered the world of weekly periodicals, but the true seat of power, the pinnacle of journalistic influence, remained Fleet Street. The daily newspapers were the domain of the establishment. They set the national agenda. They advised governments. They were the voice of the nation. To the old guard of Fleet Street, the university-educated men who wrote long, ponderous leaders on foreign policy and parliamentary procedure, Alfred Harmsworth was an upstart, a purveyor of trivialities for the masses, not a serious journalist. They dismissed his publications with a sneer, famously calling them the penny drivel for the semi-literate. This condescension was like a red rag to a bull for a man who had spent his life fighting for security and respectability. For Alfred, conquering Fleet Street became an obsession. It was not just about making more money. It was about gaining respect, about wielding real power. He believed that the daily newspapers were dinosaurs trapped in a bygone era. They were too expensive for the average person, too ponderous in their style, too disconnected from the real interests and concerns of the majority of the population. He was convinced he could create a daily newspaper that embodied all the principles that had made Answers a success: a low price, concise articles, human interest, and a direct, engaging style. He would create a newspaper for the clerk, the shop assistant, the suburban housewife. He would create a newspaper for the new Britain that the Industrial Revolution had forged. The decision to launch a daily newspaper was the brothers' biggest gamble yet. It was a capital-intensive, high-risk venture. The established papers had immense prestige and deep roots. Failure would be public and spectacular. Many on Fleet Street predicted, with a certain amount of glee, that the magazine man would fall flat on his face, that his populist tricks would not work in the serious world of daily news. But they fundamentally underestimated Alfred Harmsworth. They saw him as a mere entertainer. They failed to see him for what he truly was, a revolutionary who was about to set fire to their comfortable, exclusive world. With the vast fortune accumulated from Amalgamated Press, and with Herald's peerless financial management to back the venture, they were ready to take on the giants. Their weapon of choice would be called the Daily Mail. The year is 1896. Queen Victoria is in the twilight of her reign, and the British Empire, painted red across the globe, is at the zenith of its power and arrogance. But on Fleet Street, the grimy, ink-stained artery of the nation's press, a revolution is brewing. Alfred Harmsworth, now 31 years old, a millionaire many times over, and the undisputed king of the magazine world, is preparing his assault on the inner sanctum of British journalism. His plan is audacious, meticulously calculated, and designed to shatter the old order. The Daily Mail was not conceived as just another newspaper. It was conceived as an entirely new kind of communication, a daily bulletin for a new, modern age. For months, the project was shrouded in secrecy, known only by its code name, the Evening News Plus. Harmsworth assembled a team of the brightest and most ambitious young journalists he could find, luring them away from established papers with the promise of unprecedentedly high salaries and the thrill of being part of a new venture. He instilled in them his core philosophy, which he famously summarized in a memo to his staff: explain, simplify, clarify. He wanted short articles, no more than 200 words if possible. He demanded punchy, active headlines that told a story in a single glance. He insisted on a clear, direct prose that could be understood by anyone, from a duchess to a dustman, a style free from the ponderous Latinate clauses that filled the columns of his rivals. His most revolutionary decision, the one that sent shock waves of disbelief and derision through the clubs of Fleet Street, was the price. At a time when established daily papers sold for a penny, a significant sum for a working man, Harmsworth announced the Daily Mail would sell for a halfpenny. This was a direct declaration of war. He was making his paper accessible to the entire nation, transforming a daily newspaper from a middle-class luxury into an everyday commodity. His rivals were aghast. They claimed it was impossible to produce a quality newspaper for such a low price. They called it financial suicide, a vulgar stunt doomed to fail. What they failed to grasp was the Harmsworth model, honed to perfection in the magazine trade: Low price drives massive circulation, and massive circulation attracts lucrative advertising revenue. It was a formula that had worked for his periodicals, and he was betting his fortune it would work for a daily. On May 4th, 1896, after a frantic period of preparation in their new state-of-the-art offices at Carmelite House, the first issue of the Daily Mail hit the streets of London. It looked and felt completely different from its competitors. It was lighter, brighter, and more organized. The front page, which on other papers was a dense, unreadable wall of classified ads, featured actual news, clearly laid out with bold headlines. Inside, the content was a carefully curated mix of breaking news, brisk political commentary, and features designed to appeal to a broad audience. There was a dedicated women's page titled The Woman's Realm, covering fashion, cooking, and social gossip, a recognition that women were a vital and untapped part of the readership. There were articles on health, science, and the arts. It was, as Alfred promised, the busy man's newspaper and the paper of the home. The public response was instantaneous and phenomenal. The initial print run of 100,000 copies sold out within hours. Within months, circulation had climbed to nearly 400,000, easily surpassing every other newspaper in the country. Soon after the turn of the century, during the Boer War, it was selling over 1 million copies a day, a figure that was simply unimaginable to the old guard of Fleet Street. Alfred Harmsworth had not just launched a successful newspaper. He had created a new market and fundamentally rewired the economics of the entire industry. Advertisers, once hesitant, now flocked to the Daily Mail, eager to reach its enormous and diverse readership. The halfpenny paper, once mocked, had become the most profitable and powerful journalistic enterprise in the world. Harmsworth, still only in his early 30s, became the dominant figure on Fleet Street, a man both feared and admired. He was given the moniker the Napoleon of Fleet Street for his strategic genius, his boundless energy, and his utterly autocratic style. He was a hands-on proprietor, obsessively involved in every detail of the paper. He would read every edition cover to cover and bombard his editors with telegrams at all hours of the day and night, praising a well-written headline or damning a poorly constructed sentence. He had an uncanny, almost psychic ability to feel the pulse of the nation, to know what his readers were thinking and what they wanted to read, often before they knew it themselves. His influence was amplified during the Second Boer War from 1899 to 1902. The Daily Mail embraced a fiercely patriotic, jingoistic tone, championing the cause of the British Empire and demonizing its Boer enemies. While criticized by liberals for its sensationalism and for fanning the flames of war fever, its coverage was immensely popular, perfectly capturing the national mood and driving sales even higher. Harmsworth dispatched the best war correspondents, including a young Edgar Wallace, and pioneered the use of maps, diagrams, and photographs to bring the distant conflict to life for readers back home. It was during the Boer War that the Daily Mail cemented its identity as the voice of Middle England, patriotic, imperialist, and deeply suspicious of foreign rivals, particularly the rising power of Germany. The profits from the Daily Mail were colossal, and the Harmsworth brothers continued to expand their empire. In 1903, they launched the Daily Mirror. Alfred's initial concept was another radical idea, a newspaper created by women for women. He hired an all-female editorial team, a move unheard of at the time. However, for once his golden touch failed him. The concept failed to catch on. In a display of his characteristic ruthlessness and pragmatism, Alfred quickly abandoned the original plan. In 1904, he relaunched the Daily Mirror as an illustrated paper, filled with photographs and targeting a mass audience. He slashed the price to a halfpenny, and the Daily Mirror soon became the second great pillar of his newspaper empire, pioneering the art of photojournalism in Britain and proving that even Northcliffe's failures could be turned into resounding successes. Honors and titles followed. In 1905, Alfred Harmsworth was elevated to the peerage, becoming Baron Northcliffe of the Isle of Thanet. His brother Harold became Sir Harold Harmsworth, a baronet. But Northcliffe's ambition was not sated by commercial success or social status. He craved the ultimate prize, influence over the establishment itself. He began acquiring the very papers that had once looked down on him. In 1905, he bought The Observer, one of the oldest and most respected Sunday newspapers. Then, in 1908, he made his most audacious move yet. He acquired a controlling interest in the Times of London. The Times was more than a newspaper. It was a national institution, the Thunderer, the traditional paper of record for the British elite. Its finances were in disarray, and its circulation was dwindling, but its prestige was unparalleled. Northcliffe's takeover was seen by many as an act of sacrilege, the barbarian at the gates of the temple. But Northcliffe saw it as his crowning achievement. He set about modernizing the paper with surprising subtlety, lowering its price, introducing headlines, and injecting a new sense of urgency into its news gathering, all while carefully preserving its reputation for authority. He had now conquered Fleet Street from both ends, from the mass-market Daily Mail to the elite The Times. By 1914, his newspaper group controlled an astonishing 40% of the morning newspaper circulation in Britain, 45% of the evening, and 15% of the Sunday. The Harmsworth Press was, without question, the most powerful and influential in the world. This immense power would be tested and magnified by the cataclysm of the First World War. When war broke out in August 1914, Northcliffe threw his papers wholeheartedly behind the national cause. The Daily Mail became a powerful tool for recruitment, propaganda, and maintaining public morale. But Northcliffe was no mere government mouthpiece. He saw himself as a watchdog, a guardian of the national interest, and he was utterly unafraid to challenge the political and military leadership when he felt they were failing. He believed patriotism meant ensuring the country was led competently, not offering blind support to the powerful. His most dramatic intervention came in the spring of 1915. Reports from the front lines suggested that British troops were being slaughtered in futile attacks because they were hampered by a severe shortage of high-explosive shells. The army was being supplied with the wrong kind of ammunition, primarily shrapnel shells, which were useless against entrenched enemy positions. While the Liberal government of Prime Minister Herbert Asquith sought to downplay the issue, Northcliffe saw it as a national scandal, a betrayal of the men in the trenches. On May 21, 1915, the Daily Mail published a bombshell of an article under the headline, "The Shells Scandal, Lord Kitchener's Tragic Blunder." It was a direct, savage attack on Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, a revered national hero whose face adorned the famous "Your Country Needs You" recruitment posters. The article accused him of incompetence, of lying to the public, and of failing to supply the army with the munitions it needed to win the war. The public backlash against the Daily Mail was immediate and furious. Northcliffe was branded a traitor, a sensationalist undermining the war effort for personal gain. His effigy was burned. Copies of the paper were torn up on the floor of the London Stock Exchange. Its circulation plummeted by hundreds of thousands overnight. It seemed that the Napoleon of Fleet Street had finally overreached. his arrogance leading him to attack an untouchable icon. But Northcliffe held his nerve. He knew his information, fed to him by senior military figures, and his own correspondence at the front, was correct. And within days, the political ground began to shift. The revelations in the Daily Mail, combined with pressures from other quarters, destabilized Asquith's government. The Shell crisis forced a political reckoning. Asquith was compelled to form a new coalition government, bringing in opposition conservatives to shore up his position. A new department, the Ministry of Munitions, was created to solve the supply crisis, and it was placed under the leadership of the dynamic and ambitious David Lloyd George. The shell shortage was real, and Northcliffe had been vindicated. He had taken on the most popular man in the country and the entire government, endured a storm of public abuse, and he had won. It was the most stunning demonstration of press power in British history. He had shown that his newspapers could not just report on the government, they could effectively break it. His power continued to grow. In late 1916, he used his papers to orchestrate another political coup. Convinced that Prime Minister Asquith was a weak and indecisive war leader, he launched a relentless campaign to undermine him, portraying him as tired and out of his depth. The constant pressure from the Northcliffe press was instrumental in Asquith's resignation and his replacement by David Lloyd George, a man Northcliffe believed had the ruthless energy needed to win the war. Lloyd George, in turn, recognized Northcliffe's immense value and his dangerous potential as an enemy. In 1918, he appointed him director of propaganda in enemy countries. Operating from Crew House, Northcliffe masterminded a sophisticated psychological warfare campaign, dropping millions of leaflets over German lines, designed to erode the morale of enemy soldiers and civilians. His brother Harold, now Lord Rothermere, also served in the government, becoming the first Secretary of State for Air or Air Minister when the Air Ministry was created in early 1918, and overseeing a massive expansion of Britain's aerial forces. The Harmsworth brothers were no longer just press barons. They were integral parts of the British state at war, wielding influence that was almost presidential in its scope. Lord Beaverbrook, a rival press baron, would later write that Northcliffe was the greatest figure who ever strode down Fleet Street. But with this godlike power came an immense and dangerous hubris, and the seeds of a great personal tragedy were already being sown. The end of the Great War in November 1918 should have been Lord Northcliffe's moment of ultimate triumph. The German Empire, which he had so vociferously warned against for over a decade, lay in ruins. The British government was led by a Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, whom he had effectively installed in power. His newspapers were more dominant than ever, and his personal influence was at its absolute zenith. He attended the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, not merely as a journalist, but as a quasi-delegate, a self-appointed spokesman for the British people whose opinions were sought by presidents and prime ministers. He believed he had won the war, and now he expected to dictate the peace. But the dizzying heights of power often precede a devastating fall. For Northcliffe, the fall would not be political or financial, but deeply, terrifyingly personal, a descent into the labyrinth of a mind at war with itself. His relationship with Prime Minister Lloyd George, the man he had once championed, quickly and spectacularly soured. Northcliffe, through his newspapers, advocated for a harsh, punitive peace against Germany, a peace that would cripple the nation for generations. Lloyd George, navigating the complex realities of international diplomacy and the need for a stable Europe, found Northcliffe's constant public hectoring to be an infuriating liability. The two men, Both titans of ego and ambition clashed bitterly. Northcliffe felt betrayed, believing Lloyd George was ignoring the will of the people, a will that Northcliffe believed he alone articulated. This growing sense of being undermined, of his rightful influence being thwarted by lesser men, began to curdle into something darker and more obsessive. It was the beginning of a paranoia that would ultimately consume him. Subtle changes in his behavior, once dismissed as the eccentricities of a genius, became more pronounced. His legendary energy tipped over into a frantic, manic restlessness. His self-belief, once his greatest asset, swelled into a dangerous megalomania, and he began to see conspiracies everywhere. In private moments captured in his wife's diaries, he would shift from dictating triumphant plans for his papers to whispering about poison in his tea. He saw conspiracies everywhere, not as a simple madman, but as a master strategist who believed the whole world was now playing his game and playing it against him. His genius had finally turned inward, devouring its host. The root of this tragic decline was physical. In 1921, during a world tour intended to be a victory lap, a celebration of his global influence, Northcliffe fell seriously ill. He was diagnosed with a streptococcal infection which led to bacterial endocarditis, a severe and persistent inflammation of the lining of the heart. In the pre-antibiotic era, it was often a slow-motion death sentence. But the disease had another, more insidious effect. The persistent low-grade infection and the toxins it released into his bloodstream began to affect his brain, likely causing small emboli, clots, that starved parts of the brain of oxygen. The medical reality was a creeping systemic poisoning of his body and mind. Publicly, however, cruel rumors began to circulate, whispers of tertiary syphilis being the true cause of his madness. A rumor that has been largely dismissed by modern historians, but which added to the tragedy of his public unraveling, staining his reputation even as his life fell apart. His behavior on the world tour became the stuff of legend. While traveling through Switzerland, he developed a delusion that a member of his entourage was trying to assassinate him, and he took to carrying a loaded revolver at all times. On the ship to America, he accused his personal secretary of being a German spy. He would send streams of rambling, paranoid telegrams back to his newspaper offices in London, at one moment promoting an office boy to a senior editorial position, the next firing a loyal, long-serving editor for some imagined slight. His business decisions became chaotic. He ordered the price of the Times to be slashed without consulting its board, throwing the venerable newspaper into financial turmoil. The vast, intricate media machine he had built with such precision was now being shaken to its foundations by the erratic whims of its creator, who was thousands of miles away. His wife, Lady Northcliffe, who accompanied him on the trip, watched in horror as the husband she knew disappeared, replaced by a suspicious, agitated, and sometimes violent stranger. He was eventually persuaded to return to London, his condition worsening by the day. The journey home was an ordeal. He imagined assassins in every port and spies among the crew. Upon his return, his paranoia intensified. For a time, he was confined to a makeshift wooden hut built on the roof of his London home at Carlton House Terrace, as he had developed a delusion that he was a royal personage and could only breathe pure country air, free from the poisonous miasmas of the city below. The Napoleon of Fleet Street, the man who had commanded the attention of millions and been a government to his will, was now a prisoner of his own disintegrating mind, shouting orders at imaginary subordinates and railing against phantom conspirators from a hut on a roof. On August 14, 1922, Alfred Harmsworth, Lord Northcliffe, died. He was only 57 years old. He left behind an estate worth millions, a revolutionary legacy in journalism, and a profound power vacuum. He had no legitimate heirs, though he had secretly fathered several illegitimate children, a final hidden complexity in a life lived so publicly. The king was dead, and the empire he had built now passed into the hands of his brother. Harold Harmsworth, now the first Viscount Rothermere, inherited sole control of the vast newspaper empire. For more than 30 years he had been the quiet, steadying hand behind his brother's volatile genius. Now he was the undisputed monarch. In business he was just as capable as Alfred, if not more so. He consolidated the empire, managed it profitably, and continued its commercial success throughout the 1920s. But in the realm of politics and public influence, Rothermere would prove to be a far different and ultimately far more dangerous proprietor. His worldview, which would come to define his disastrous political interventions in the 1930s, was shaped by two profound and overlapping traumas. The first was the immense personal grief of losing two of his three sons in the First World War. His eldest, Vere, was killed in action in 1916. Another son, Vivian, died from wounds in 1918. This unimaginable loss instilled in him a deep-seated horror of another European conflict, a desire for peace at almost any cost. The second was a visceral, all-consuming fear of Bolshevism. The Russian Revolution had terrified the wealthy elites of Europe, and Rothermere saw the specter of communism, with its promise to expropriate private property, as the single greatest threat to his class, his fortune, and Western civilization itself. It was through this twin lens of pacifism and anti-communism that he would view the turbulent politics of the 1930s. As Germany reeled from the aftermath of the war, the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, and the economic chaos of the Great Depression, a new political force began to emerge, the Nazi Party. Where others saw a thuggish anti-Semitic movement built on violence and resentment, Rothermere saw a bulwark against communism. He saw Adolf Hitler as a strong, dynamic leader who was restoring German national pride, reviving the economy, and, crucially, standing up to the Soviet Union. In the early 1930s, the Daily Mail, under Rothermere's direct control, began a campaign of startling and, in retrospect, horrifying support for Hitler and the burgeoning fascist movements in Europe. Rothermere traveled to Germany, met with Hitler on several occasions, and returned to write glowing editorials. In 1933, his paper praised the new Nazi regime as a force for good. In an exclusive interview, he lauded Hitler as a man of patriotism and courage. This editorial support soon extended to Britain's own fascist movement. On January 15, 1934, Rothermere wrote and published a notorious article in the Daily Mail under the headline, "Hurrah for the Black Shirts." In it, he openly endorsed Sir Oswald Mosley and the British Union of Fascists, urging young, patriotic Britons to join their ranks. He presented the Black Shirts as a modern, disciplined force that could protect Britain from the chaos of communism and revitalize the nation. For a brief, shocking period, the most popular newspaper in Britain effectively became the official mouthpiece of British fascism. The backlash was significant. Many readers were appalled. Jewish businesses and others who opposed fascism began to boycott the paper, withdrawing their advertising. But Rothermere, cocooned by his wealth and utterly convinced of his own righteousness, pressed on. He used his paper to support Hitler's foreign policy, endorsing the remilitarization of the Rhineland, and later the annexation of Austria and the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. He saw these actions not as naked aggression, but as the reasonable correcting of the injustices of the Treaty of Versailles, and as necessary steps to create a strong Germany that could act as a buffer against Stalin's Russia. His entanglement with the Nazi regime went beyond mere editorial support. He became closely associated with a shadowy and charismatic figure named Stephanie von Hohenlohe, an Austrian princess who was a confidant of Hitler and the Nazi elite. She acted as a go-between for Rothermere and the Nazi leadership, carrying messages and arranging meetings. Rothermere was utterly captivated by her, providing her with lavish financial support and relying on her for political intelligence. He was seemingly oblivious to what many others already suspected, that Princess Stephanie was an active agent of the Nazi state, a spy using her charm and connections to influence powerful men like him. His letters to her were fawning and indiscreet, referring to Hitler as Adolf the Great, and revealing a shocking level of naivety, or perhaps a willful blindness to the true nature of the regime he so admired. It was only the brutal, thuggish violence of Mosley's black shirts at a massive rally in Olympia, London, in June 1934, that finally gave Rothermere pause. The public revulsion at the spectacle of fascists savagely beating up hecklers was so great that supporting the BUF became politically toxic. Rothermere, seeing the damage to his paper's reputation and circulation, abruptly withdrew his support. He would later claim that he had never supported their anti-Semitism, only their anti-communist stance. But the stain was indelible. As the 1930s wore on and Hitler's violent expansionist and virulently anti-Semitic intentions became undeniable to the rest of the world, Rothermere's position became increasingly untenable. The man who had inherited the most powerful press empire in the world had used it to champion the darkest political force of the 20th century. When war finally broke out in 1939, the Daily Mail swung behind the national effort, but its proprietor's reputation was shattered. He died in Bermuda in 1940, a diminished and isolated figure, his final years reportedly spent trying to erase the records of his pro-Nazi correspondence. His legacy was forever tainted by his catastrophic misjudgment. The Harmsworth dynasty had survived the madness of its founder, only to be disgraced by the ideology of his successor. The era of the all-powerful politically interventionist press baron was over, brought to a shameful end by a fatal combination of personal grief, political fear, and ideological blindness. The death of Lord Rothermere in 1940, coming less than 2 decades after the death of his brother Lord Northcliffe, marked the definitive end of an era. The age of the larger-than-life press baron, a figure who could single-handedly make and unmake governments with the stroke of a pen, was fading into history, tainted by madness and political disgrace. The Harmsworth Empire, now a vast corporate entity known as Associated Newspapers, passed to Rothermere's surviving son, Esmond Harmsworth, the second Viscount Rothermere. He inherited not just a business, but a deeply complex and controversial legacy. Esmond was a different breed from his father and uncle. He was less of a political crusader and more of a pragmatic businessman, a steward rather than a Napoleon. His tenure, which lasted for a remarkable 38 years from 1940 until 1978, was a period of consolidation and careful adaptation. The world had changed profoundly. The trauma of the Second World War, a war his father had so desperately tried to avoid through appeasement, had left Britain exhausted but also more socially democratic. The old certainties were gone, deference to the establishment was eroding, and a powerful new rival to the dominance of newspapers had emerged: television. The flickering screen in the corner of the living room, began to compete for the nation's attention, offering a more immediate and visual connection to world events. News was no longer the exclusive domain of the printed page. It was now broadcast directly into people's homes with pictures and sound. Esmond understood that to survive, the Daily Mail and the other papers in the group had to adapt. Under his leadership, the paper solidified its position as the unwavering voice of conservative middle-class Britain. It remained influential, a powerful player in the political landscape, but its influence was now part of a much larger, more diverse media conversation. The days when a single proprietor could summon a prime minister or dictate war policy were gone. The empire was still vast and profitable, but the absolute monarchy had given way to a more constitutional role. The leadership then passed to Esmond's son, Vere Harmsworth, the third Viscount Rothermere, who led the company from 1978 to 1998. Vere inherited the empire at a time of immense industrial strife and technological change. He was a more aggressive figure than his father, a tough businessman who fought and won fierce battles with the powerful print unions, embracing the new computerized technologies that would revolutionize the newspaper industry and break the old Fleet Street mold forever. He was a staunch supporter of Margaret Thatcher and her conservative government, and the Daily Mail became one of her most ardent and influential champions. Yet even during this era of renewed ideological fervor, the media landscape was more fragmented than ever. Rival proprietors like Rupert Murdoch had entered the fray with a similar brand of aggressive populism, creating a fiercely competitive environment. The Harmsworth influence, while still potent, was no longer unique. Vere also began the group's international expansion, launching a bold but ultimately doomed venture to create a new French newspaper, Le Matin de Paris, and later planting the seeds for the group's future in the United States. Today, the Harmsworth legacy is in the hands of the fourth generation, Jonathan Harmsworth, the fourth Viscount Rothermere, the great-grandson of the dynasty's co-founder, Harold. Born in 1967, Jonathan inherited a powerful media group, now known as Daily Mail and General Trust, or DMGT, facing the existential challenge of the digital age. He has navigated this treacherous landscape with considerable skill. Recognizing early on that the future was online, he invested heavily in the Daily Mail's digital platform, dailymail.com. The website is a global phenomenon, a perfect distillation of the original Harmsworth formula, retooled for the 21st century. It combines breaking news with an insatiable appetite for celebrity gossip, human interest stories, and strong, often strident, opinionated commentary. Its famous sidebar of shame, with its endless scroll of paparazzi photos and celebrity slip-ups, has become a cultural touchstone. With over 200 million monthly readers worldwide, it has a reach that Lord Northcliffe, with his steam presses, could only have dreamed of. Jonathan Harmsworth, like his ancestors, has proven to have an uncanny understanding of what the mass market wants. He has become a billionaire, and in 2021 he took the company private, securing his family's control over the empire. His great-grandfather and great-grand-uncle founded over 130 years ago. Yet the nature of the family's power has fundamentally changed. Jonathan Harmsworth is a reclusive, business-focused figure, not a political puppeteer in the mold of Northcliffe or a political ideologue like the first Rothermere. The modern Daily Mail still wields considerable influence in British politics, particularly within the Conservative Party, but it does so as one powerful voice among many in a deafening, chaotic digital ecosystem. The family has learned the hard lessons of the past, largely avoiding the kind of direct, extreme political interventions that defined and ultimately disgraced the first generation, but the echoes of the past remain, particularly in the ongoing debate about the power and ethics of the press. The legacy of the Harmsworths is a deeply dualistic one. They were brilliant pioneers who democratized information, creating products that were accessible, engaging, and relevant to the lives of ordinary people. Northcliffe's new journalism broke the stuffy monopoly of the elite press and gave a voice to the aspirations and anxieties of the burgeoning middle class. However, they also unleashed a form of journalism that was often sensationalist, intrusive, and politically manipulative. The charge leveled against Northcliffe of wielding power without responsibility has haunted the British press ever since. The very culture of aggressive, scoop-driven, and often intrusive journalism that he perfected can be seen as a distant ancestor to the scandals that have plagued the industry in recent years. The 2011 to 2012 Leveson Inquiry, a massive public investigation into the culture, practices, and ethics of the British press, was in many ways a reckoning with the world the Harmsworths had created. It scrutinized the often unhealthy relationship between politicians and the press, and the sometimes brutal tactics used in the pursuit of a story. Even today, the Harmsworth empire finds itself embroiled in legal battles that speak to this complex legacy. In 2021, the Mail on Sunday lost a high-profile privacy lawsuit brought by Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex, for publishing a private letter she had written to her father. The court's decision, which forced the paper to pay substantial damages and issue a public apology on its front page, was a powerful reminder that even in the modern era, there are limits to press freedom, and that the balance between the public's right to know and an individual's right to privacy remains a fierce and contested battleground. The story of the Harmsworth family is more than just a history of a media dynasty. It is the story of the birth of the modern media age itself. Alfred and Harold Harmsworth understood, perhaps better than anyone before or since, that information is power. They harnessed the new technologies of their day, the high-speed printing press, the telegraph, to build an empire that could shape the thoughts of millions. They created a new language of communication, short, sharp, emotional, and relentlessly engaging, that has become the default grammar of our own digital world. From the Napoleon of Fleet Street, who believed he could bend nations to his will, to the tragic figures cursed by madness and ideological folly, their saga serves as a timeless and resonant cautionary tale. It reminds us that the power to inform is also the power to distort. The power to engage is also the power to enrage. And the power to hold the influential to account comes with a profound responsibility not to become an unaccountable power itself. In an age of social media, fake news, and algorithm-driven outrage, the questions raised by the rise and legacy of the Harmsworths are more urgent than ever. Who controls the narrative? Who shapes our understanding of the world? And where, in the relentless pursuit of an audience, is the line between informing the public and manipulating it? The empire the brothers built still stands, a testament to their genius, but it also stands as a permanent monument to the enduring and often dangerous power of the press.